Greetings and welcome to the Power of Vintage. I began my computer adventures, if you couldn't tell from my other videos, with Atari computers. I am a big time Atari fan. I love them. They kind of formed me and formed my love of computing tech growing up. But at the same time, that also spills over into other areas. I really love digging into all sorts of older computers. IBM PS2s, the Steve Jobs era Power PCs. I find them all extremely fun to dig into and learn about. And today, I want to talk about one of the most iconic computers of all time. This is the Commodore 64. It really is one of those computers that brought computing to the masses. And share my perspective, or the perspective of an Atarian. All right, let's get to it. All right, I want to touch base on some of my very first memories associated with seeing this computer for the first time, this bread bin Commodore 64. I have some memories of going over to a friend's house when I was a kid, around the same time that I had just gotten an Atari ST and was enjoying it, but he had this other computer, this really brownish beige computer, sitting on the floor in the kids' playroom, connected to a TV. And he said, let's play a game. I was like, okay, dude, I love computer games. This is awesome, right? And it was at Tyler's house, and Tyler had the Commodore 64. And he pulls out a cassette tape. I was like, we're going to play some music on it? No, this is how you load programs. I had only seen diskettes. 3.5-inch discs and 5.25-inch discs. Loading a program from a cassette was like, whoa, that is so cool. And so we loaded a game, and it took a long time to load that game. And it took a longer time to load that game. But eventually the game loaded up, and it was Choplifter. And we played it. We played it for, I don't know, for half hour, 45 minutes, whatever it was, having a blast playing that game, taking turns, flying, blowing up the buildings, rescuing the prisoners and getting them back, and blowing up the tanks, or just exploding our helicopter. Awesome experience. Great memory from that time. Later on, over at another friend's house, playing Castle Wolfenstein, and in hearing the kind of digitized German voices of the guards, and really enjoying those things. Now, those are the earliest memories I have of the Commodore 64. Now, I want to touch base on a couple of computer facts of the history of this Commodore 64 computer. I am by no means going to be the expert, or this will necessarily be a complete story, because there are plenty of people who know tremendously more than I do. But the computer launched in 1982 and actually was in production until 1994, from what I read. It's actually pretty amazing to think of that longevity. And because of that, or in part of that, in addition to the bang for the buck that you got from this computer, this thing sold like crazy in the 80s in particular, selling between 12 and 17 million, according to Wikipedia. So I'm not saying that that's 100% truth, but it's probably in that ballpark. It's probably not that far off. As I mentioned, the amount of these Commodore 64s that were in the market was kind of crazy. Apparently, there were a couple of years where the market share of all computers, or its market share among all computers, was, I think, 30 to 40%. It might have been the US, it might have been global. I'm not sure exactly what the context is of it. But to be fair, anything where you're talking 30, 40% of any market with one single computer, that was pretty dominant. And to say that it had an impact on many, many people growing up is an understatement, right? So many people got their early fix on computers and hooked into the technology segment because of this computer, probably more so than any other computer, just by virtue of the fact that this is what many people had. There are other computers elsewhere in the world, the ZX Spectrum, you had the Sinclairs, even the Ataris, but really this guy was the most prolific of all of those. And part of the reason behind the success of this, and you may love him, you may hate him, but Jack Tramiel was in charge of Commodore at the time this came out, and he had a standard practice that he would run with is getting the, what does he call it? Performance without the price, right? Is kind of his mantra. He used that mantra with the Atari ST, the advertising for that. But really, that concept started with the Commodore 64 in particular, and it is time of the Commodore, where you got the biggest bang for that buck. The Commodore 64, my understanding is that it launched at $599. It's soon after, within I think a year, 1983, it dropped to $300. And by 1985, I believe it was $175, $195, something along those lines, $199. But the price was dropping. In part, that's due to the fact that the components, the price of RAM, of any other components within that were actually dropping significantly as well. Also, I mean, if you look at this computer, while it's relatively robust, probably from today's standards, if you compared it to the other systems that were around at that time, it's not as robust as an Apple II, not as robust as an Atari 800 or even an 800 XL, to be fair. But it was a great computer and gave a lot of bang for the buck. Really, really cool thing. From a capability standpoint, if you looked at the competing computers at the time that the Commodore 64 launched, there's only really one real competitor. And I kind of touched on this briefly in my video on the Atari 800. The Atari 800 had similar video capabilities, similar audio capabilities. And they had a lot of similarities. There were differences, obviously, as well, but that was the only real competitor. And at the time when it launched, 1982, as I mentioned a little earlier, the Atari 800 was priced at around $800, $900, just south of $1,000. Well, this was $599 and soon dropped even further. It's kind of crazy to think, why would you buy an Atari 800 that had the ecosystem, at least initially, but they're both very, very capable machines. This had 64 kilobytes of RAM. The Atari 800 had 48 kilobytes of RAM. Lots of things to compare back and forth. And I'm not intending to make this a comparison of the Atari 800 versus the Commodore 64. I actually do have a video coming eventually on that, but I want to just touch base deeply on the Commodore 64 and just kind of walk through, do a dive into this computer. All right, let's start digging into these guys. The story on how I came across these computers is kind of a little funny one. Right, so as I mentioned earlier, I really like digging into various different computers, and as such, I need to find more of them. And so I'm typically looking on places like Facebook Marketplace, eBay, Craigslist, etc., just kind of seeing if I can't find any computers that are at a reasonable price. And as such, I came across a listing, not for Commodore 64s, but for an Amiga 1200 and an Amiga 600. Which, again, here in the US, not a very common thing. I don't think I've really, on Craigslist in my area, have ever seen an Amiga listed for sale there. But I was like, that sounds awesome. Let me see if I can't get it, pick those up, or pick one of them up at least. So I reached out to the seller. He said, it's too late now. I've already sold them. But I do have a Commodore 64 that doesn't work. It's like, or would you be interested in that? I was like, yeah, sure. I think that'd be kind of cool. So that was this guy here. So I went and set up some time to meet with the guy and pick this guy up. When I get there, he says, well, do you still want that the Amiga 600 or Amiga 1200? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Apparently the potential buyer had ghosted him, or buyers had ghosted him, because he'd been contacted by a whole slew of folks. I was the first person to show up. He asked me if I wanted it. Unfortunately, I didn't have I try to take a little extra cash anytime I go looking for these kind of computers to see if they have some other stuff that they might be interested in selling along with the computers that they had listed specifically. So I ended up picking up this Commodore 64 non-working, the 64 see the 1541 floppy drive, all complete with box, and the Amiga 600. I just didn't have enough cash with me to be able to get the 1200, and didn't have the spouse's blessing to do that either. So we stuck with these items and got them. But it was actually really great because the guy, he was a programmer, or did quite a bit of programming in the 80s on the Commodore 64s as well as on the Amigas. And he shared some of his original software with me, some of the code he'd written. We have a whole slew of diskettes, a monochrome monitor, a bunch of magazines. He asked if he wanted any floppy disks. I was like, sure, I love floppy disks. They're awesome. So that was actually a really cool experience. It was great to hear his stories as well. All right, so let's dig into this bread bin first. We'll kind of just open this guy up. We're going to get a nice little crack. We'll disconnect the power LED over here. Disconnect the floppy. Not the floppy, the keyboard. Why do I call that a floppy? Disconnect the keyboard here. And then we will set this guy off to the side. Oh, wrong kind of screwdriver, that is. There we go. All right, getting that guy open. And this is a pretty computer as well. I think it's really interesting how the style changed. This looks a bit more, actually looks a lot like the 128 and a bit more like the Amigas. So obviously the design language shifted over time. All right. Make sure I got everything off. Yeah, it's just a clip. Never want to break these things. Never want to push or pull too hard on them. There we go. Just one little clip. You need to get that off. And now we'll remove the keyboard screwed on. Forgot about that. I haven't taken this one apart too much. I've really dug into the bread bin just by virtue of the fact that it needed repair. This guy didn't need any repair, really. It was functional right out of the box. There we go. Keyboard off. This is not the floppy drive. That is the keyboard. And now we'll just remove the RF shield. And if the audio sounds a bit different than my previous videos, I am working with a new microphone. We'll see if it works out better. Hopefully it does, than some of the other lav mics I've tried before in the past. I actually reached out to the gentleman from 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast, because I really liked the way his audio sounded. Unfortunately, the mic that he had recommended, I couldn't find anywhere. It wasn't for sale, at least where I was looking. So I was probably just looking in the wrong place, but it's an excellent sounding mic. So I picked up something else. So if you're watching this, I did not listen in vain. I did see if I could find it, but was unable to. All right, here we go. So this RF shield, obviously, it's got these little legs on it to try to act as a heat sink in some way, shape, or form. It obviously did decently, but isn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. All right, so let's start. So what you see on the left, this is one of the more, I would say, original 1984. So it's a not original motherboard, a little bit later one. This is considered, it's called the short board, but really at the end of the day, they have the same capabilities. And if you are looking carefully at this one over here, you'll notice that I have an aftermarket or a modern PLA replacement there. So this is that was what was wrong with this computer. I actually just able to pop out the PLA chip, put a new one of these replacements in, and boom, worked like a charm. All right, so let's dig into this short board. This isn't the short board. This is the older board and the bread bin computer. The short board's back here. They're basically the same in many ways. They're not tremendously different, and especially when it comes to the ICs. We have here the VIC-2 chip, and the VIC-2 chip is the video coprocessor. If you know anything about the Commodore 64, this is really one of the elements that make this computer stand out versus many of the competitors. Obviously, the Atari 800, the Atari 8-bit line of computers had their own GTIA chip as well that had a lot of capabilities as well. And the Pokey for their sound. In the case of the Commodore 64, we have here the SID chip. And the SID chip provided a lot of capability that was even more advanced than some of the later computers that came after it, with a tremendous amount of capability within the three separate channels. The 3-channel sound that it produced, you had a bunch of different waveforms you could use as well, which allowed for some of the crazy people doing demos to get some pretty cool chip tunes coming out of this guy. We have down here, this is the PLA chip. The PLA chip is effectively the glue that kind of holds all the various different ICs together and keeps things functioning properly. We have back here, this is the CPU, the 6510. Effectively, it's just a variant of the 6502, right? The venerable CPU that's used all over the place. This guy runs at 1 megahertz in NTSC land, slightly less than a megahertz in PAL land, but for all intents and purposes, they're virtually identical. Also, here we have the RAM chips that make up the 64 kilobytes of RAM. We have the 2 CIA chips, the various different ROMs, and a whole slew of various different logic chips on the board, ICs on the board. One of the things you'll notice a little bit on this board here, I've got heat sinks covering up some of these ICs here, but on this board, the 64C board back here, maybe you can see better if I bring it up closer with that. You have the MOS on these various different chips. And that is from the Commodore chip fab that they had fully integrated within the company. And that is another reason why they were able to offer these computers at a much lower price than their competition, right? So the competitors didn't have their own chip fabs. Because they didn't have their own chip fabs, they weren't necessarily able to match the prices that Commodore was able to go to, because they had the chip fabs had to sell to, say, Atari, to Apple, to whomever else. They made a profit on the chips, and then they had Atari or the other OEMs had to mark up the computers even more beyond that. So in order to make a reasonable profit on top, whereas because of the vertical integration at Commodore, they were able to better go to market with that product. Okay, let's get this computer set up. There's a couple things we're going to use today. We're actually going to I want to show a few bits of software and how things changed over time. So what you have, at least initially, there's quite a few programs that started out that were kind of like this Pac-Man, and you'll see this in a minute, where it's almost identical to what you would have seen with the Atari 8-bit line of computers. I think it actually looks totally identical to what I would see in the Atari 800. And then we move on to some meaningful differentiation. Let's look at Ultima 4, one of my favorites, obviously. And this is actually, I would say, one of the best 8-bit versions of it. Actually, I think it is the best 8-bit version. And that's even before there are some folks that have actually gone in and even modernized it most recently I'm actually looking at the original one here with this one. This is the original version of Ultima 4. Then beyond that, we'll go through. We'll use this lovely Pi 15410. Excuse me. That replicates the floppy drive with some other software on it to have some show you what kind of some of the later stuff is, more recent updates to this are. All right, let's get to it. The 1541 attached. We're going to use a real floppy disk today to begin with some of the software here. Power it on. There we go. Lovely screen here. And I'm going to touch on one of the differences between the Commodore 64 and the Atari 8-bits. A very big difference is loading time from floppy disk. Just in general. There are ways to speed it up, but in the base methodology, the base capability, the Commodore 64 takes forever to load. Let's get the volume up on this guy. All right, so as you can see here, I just turned off the sound with this guy. I had the joystick plugged in the wrong port and it was causing the issues. But that said, this looks literally identical to what you would see on an Atari 8-bit using S-video output, right? So this is an S-video output signal that we have here. We're not using composite. It looks excellent, but it's literally the exact same version. All right, so let's move on to Ultima, where we have actually a slightly upgraded version, or upgraded, differentiated version, where you start seeing some of the programmers starting to use some of the awesomeness that the Commodore 64 can offer, some of the differentiation. Yeah, and with this game here, the loading time is substantially longer. All right, here we come. Now as it loads the music up, what you'll notice is the music is excellent. It's fantastic. I mean, it has music. The Atari 8-bit. The Atari 8-bit version of this does not have music. I'm just muting it again so I can talk to this. So it has that capability here. Could the Atari 8-bit have done it? Had the music? Probably. But it was programmed for the 48K of the Atari 800, so it doesn't have that. It's an excellent signal out, excellent view out, looks awesome, runs well. All right, so that is part 2. And actually, let's just, and the nice thing is also is that you have both sound effects and music here. And so that's, again, taking even more advantage of the capabilities of the Commodore 64, again, versus the Atari 8-bits, even versus actually the Apple IIs with a Mockingbird, another very expensive thing, in addition to an expensive computer, could replicate this. But you for the price, for what you had here, this was vastly superior to anything else. All right, now we are going to use the Pi 1541. as you see in the back. And we're going to load up some different games, some more modern games, and see how those work. I think in this way, this is one of my favorites. This is Super Mario Brothers. And this is really taking the Commodore 64 to its limits. And this is something that, you know, it also takes advantage of the Commodore 128 capabilities, faster CPU, etc. This is just super cool. I absolutely love this guy. And it's amazing that there are people out here who were able to get this coded and looking and sounding pretty much like what you would have had with an NES. There is some slowness, though. You'll notice that here. Here we go. I mean, as you can hear, the sound is excellent. It plays very similarly. Using a joystick like this, it's not exactly the best. Now, obviously, I could use a joypad of some sort that actually maps the second button to the up on the joystick. And that would actually play a lot like what you have with the Nintendo game system. I don't know if you noticed, there's a little bit of stutter here and there occasionally, especially when you get more than a couple monsters on the screen at the same time. But it's pretty impressive what the community has been able to build with something like this. All right, we're going to try another one now. All right, now let's load up Ghosts and Goblins. This is pretty amazing. As we can get this guy loading up. Here we go. Oh. There we go. Now, as you can see, this is an excellent port. It's, again, very recent, but it shows what the Commodore 64 is really able to do. A fantastic computer, fantastic capabilities. So there you have it. That's the Commodore 64, an amazing computer from the 1990s that actually made a big splash and we're feeling the reverberations and impacts of it still today. With the many people that grew up with this guy and shaped a lot of their development when it comes to computers and technology. It's got an amazingly active community still, as you see with some of the software that's still being developed, still being ported to this computer. There is even a version of the Eye of the Beholder. This is a computer from the 90s, or not computer, this is a game from the 1990s that was on PC and I think Amiga, but it's been ported to the Commodore 64 and 128. It's just amazing that those kinds of programs are still being developed. And that's not to mention anything about the mod scene that has done some pretty amazing stuff with this computer as well. That's the software side. On the hardware side, there's plenty of different types of cartridges types of floppy drive emulators, upgrades of various different nature that are still being developed and put in place for these guys to get these guys connected to the internet. Even it's there's a cornucopia of awesomeness out there. So if you ever have the chance to pick one up, if you don't have one already, these guys are a classic. It's a super awesome thing. You can start with emulation, which is an awesome way to get to know the system and the capabilities of it as well. All right. Have a fantastic day, and I hope you enjoyed this. Like and subscribe if you liked it. If you don't. If you want to put some comments in the comments below, please do. I like to read your comments. I read all of them, almost all of them. There have been some videos where the comments just keep going and going and going, but I do appreciate the responsiveness in the community. So thank you very much again for watching. Have a fantastic day. See ya.